Welcome back, class. We're going to be finishing up during the course of these video lectures chapter 14, which will be covering psychological disorders. Once we complete this chapter, we'll be finished with unit number 5. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. As we've done in previous chapters during this semester, we'll introduce to you the topics by looking over some true-false statements, determining whether or not a statement is true or false, fact or falsehood. Okay. In some cultures, depression and schizophrenia are non-existent. Is that a true statement or a false statement? In some cultures, depression and schizophrenia are non-existent. That is a false statement. As we'll see as we go through these lectures, there are certain types of disorders that appear to be somewhat global. All right, all sorts of cultures possess them. However, there are certain types of disorders that seem to be very culture specific. Number 2, Ritalin and Adderall are stimulants but help calm hyperactivity in children with ADHD. True or false? That statement is true. Number 3, whites and Native Americans die by suicide twice as often as black Americans do. True or false? Whites and Native Americans die by suicide twice as often as black Americans do. That statement is true. Number 4, about 30% of psychologically disordered people are dangerous. That is, they are more likely than other people to commit a crime. True or false? About 30% of psychologically disordered people are dangerous. That is, they are more likely than other people to commit a crime. That statement is false. In fact, it's much more likely that people who have a psychological disorder will be the victims of crimes. Number 5. Just under 1 in 5 adult Americans suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. True or false? Just under 1 in 5 adult Americans suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. That is a true statement. Number 6, panic attacks, which strike suddenly, wreak havoc, then disappear, are forgotten by the next day. Panic attacks, which strike suddenly, wreak havoc, then disappear, are forgotten by the next day. That statement is false. Number 7, identical twins who have been raised separately sometimes develop the same phobias. True or false? Identical twins who have been raised separately sometimes develop the same phobias. That is a true statement. Number 8, in North America, today's young adults are 3 times as likely as their grandparents to report recently or ever having suffered depression. True or false? In North America, today's young adults are 3 times as likely as their grandparents to report recently or ever having suffered depression. That is a true statement. Number 9, there is strong evidence for a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia. There's a strong evidence for a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia. True or false? That statement is true. And finally, number 10, dissociative identity disorder is a type of schizophrenia. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID, is a type of schizophrenia. True or false? That statement is false, and we'll see why that is as we go through the material during this particular chapter. So, let's go ahead and start. What we'll seek to understand: what does it mean to have a mental disorder? Defining and classifying disorders. Anxiety disorders including GAD, panic, phobias, OCD, and PTSD. Mood disorders including depression and bipolar disorder. Schizophrenia. And sample of other disorders such as dissociative disorders, eating disorders, and personality disorders. And rates of diagnosis with disorders. So, a psychological disorder, what is it? A psychological disorder is a significant dysfunction in an individual's cognitions, that's thoughts, emotions, those are feelings, or behaviors, actions, what it is that they do. More understandings about disorders. Disorders are diagnosed when there is a dysfunction, behaviors which are considered maladaptive because they interfere with one's daily life. So we have this idea of they're interfering with you going to school or going to work or just living your life. There's a dysfunction, and that's when they are considered to be problematic. Disorders are diagnosed when the symptoms and behaviors are accompanied by distress, suffering. The person feels not right. They are really stressed out about what it is that they're feeling or thinking about, or what their behaviors may be. So the idea here is that, one, it can either interfere with your day-to-day life, you're just not able to cope, or it can just cause you a great deal of stress, your behaviors, your thoughts, whatever those symptoms may be. Now, a new definition, DSM-5, a disturbance in the psychological, biological, or developmental process underlying mental functioning, is also one way to think about it. Now, the term disorder is used instead of disease because the letter disease typically implies a known cause of the symptoms. And naming a disorder, you're not naming a cause such as a virus. Instead, you're naming the collection of symptoms that tend to go together. So let's look at one of the things that we've heard of quite a bit. Just about everyone has heard of ADHD, hyperactivity disorder or attention deficit disorder. Now, it is somewhat controversial because a lot of people are being diagnosed with this particular type of disorder. So let's look at it a little bit more closely. So ADHD, impulsivity mixed with inattention and or hyperactivity, can include distractibility, disorganization, fidgeting, difficulty suppressing impulses, and impaired working memory. Is this a disorder? Is it deviant? Do some people have a level of inattentiveness, impulsiveness, or restlessness that goes beyond laziness or immaturity? Is it distressful? Is the person enjoying being energetic, or are they frustrated that they can't sustain focus? Is there a dysfunction? Are the symptoms harmless fun, or do they negatively impact work relationships? All right. So the answer to all three questions is yes. For some people, ADHD is a disorder deviating greatly from the norm and causing significant distress and dysfunction. ADHD is overdiagnosed when the label is applied to children whose behavior may be a function of immaturity, culture, sleep deprivation, or other learning problems. ADHD is underdiagnosed most frequently in girls with a primarily inattentive type of ADHD when children are quietly trying to sustain focus but can't do it. So we see there is something out there, but again, we have under as well as overdiagnosing of some of these types of things. So let's understand, hopefully, the nature of psychological disorders. One reason to diagnose a disorder is to make decisions about treating the problem. Based on older understanding of psychological disorders, treatments have in the past included such things as exorcising evil spirits, beatings, caging, restraint, and drilling holes in people's skulls to let evil spirits out, for example. Pinel's new approach. Philippe Pinel, 1745 to 1826, proposed that mental disorders were not caused by demonic possession, but by stress and inhumane conditions. Pinel's moral treatment is what he called. His moral treatment involved gentleness, nature, in social interaction. So as opposed to doing the things above, like beatings or restraint, he proposed a more gentle approach, a more moral treatment for individuals who were suffering these particular types of symptoms. So Penill's interventions improved lives, but often did not effectively treat mental illness itself. But then, the discovery that the disease of syphilis caused mental symptoms by infecting the brain suggested a medical model for mental illness. So now all of a sudden people were able to see there's this physical cause that can cause people to act and behave in a certain way and have mental illness. That sort of demonstrated to people that maybe when we're seeing these mental illnesses, maybe there are medical reasons behind it. And so this gave rise to the medical model of treating mental illness. So the medical model. Psychological disorders can be seen as a psychopathology, an illness of the mind, a psychopathology. Disorders can be diagnosed, labeled as a collection of symptoms that tend to go together. People with disorders can be treated, attended to, given therapy, all with the goal of restoring mental health. Okay, so the medical model implies ideas of etiology, the cause of mental disorders. It is not always possible to determine the cause of a specific mental disorder, but in general, the assumption here is that the cause is physical and mental and not spiritual. So the biopsychosocial approach here, we have the biological influences, evolution, individual genes, brain structure and chemistry. We have the psychological influences, stress, trauma, learned helplessness, and things of that nature. We have social, cultural influences, roles, expectations, normality, and so on. The biopsychosocial approach to psychological disorders. Today's psychology studies how biological, psychological, and social cultural factors interact to produce specific psychological disorders. So we have cultural influences on disorders. Culture-bound syndromes are disorders which only seem to exist within certain cultures. They demonstrate how culture can play a role in both causing and defining a disorder. Some examples are bulimia nervosa, binging and purging. We see this in the United States. Running amok, violent outbursts. We see this in Malaysia. Hikikomori, social withdrawal. We see this in Japan. And what this is basically demonstrating is we see certain types of disorders in one culture but not in others. So we see that these demonstrate these so-called culture-bound syndromes. Again, disorders which only seem to exist in certain types of cultures. So, classifying psychological disorders. Why create classifications of mental illness? What is the value of talking about diagnosis instead of just talking about individuals? Well, diagnoses create a verbal shorthand for referring to a list of associated symptoms. Diagnoses allow us to statistically study many similar cases, learning to predict outcomes. And diagnoses can guide treatment choices. So basically, it's a way for us to have a common language that can be employed by mental health professionals so they understand they're talking about the same grouping of disorders or the same grouping of symptoms, and they can statistically analyze what is the course of this particular disorder, how many people have it at this age, that age, what are their backgrounds, and then all of this can lead us to try to figure out ways which they could be treated most effectively. So the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, okay, it's easier to count cases of autism if we have a clear definition, as an example. So we want to know what autism is. We got to have the definition and what the symptoms are and things of that nature. By doing that, it allows mental health professionals a better opportunity to identify, diagnose, understand, and research, and then ultimately treat. So there are several versions of DSM that they can continually add to. The DSM is used to justify payment for treatment, so it has to be some sort of identifiable disorder that's listed in the DSM so that healthcare professionals, mental health care professionals, can charge insurance companies, for example. It's consistent with diagnoses used by medical doctors worldwide. So in a way, what we're seeing is the DSM allows us to more scientifically and methodically examine what these disorders are like by classifying and categorizing the symptomology. So this helps us to understand as well as to come up with ways of. So, the five axes of diagnosis. The DSM suggests describing someone not just with a label, but with a five-part picture. Axis 1 is a clinical syndrome present. Axis 2 is a personality disorder or mental retardation, intellectual development disorder present. Axis 3 is a general medical condition such as diabetes, arthritis, or hypertension also present. Axis 4 are psychosocial or environmental problems such as school or housing issues also present? And Axis 5, what is the global assessment of this person's functioning? So the idea here, they're not just providing a label, they're providing a five-part picture of what is going on with a particular patient or client. So here are some of the categories of diagnosis. Diagnosis usually first diagnosed in infancy or childhood and adolescence. We have delirium and dementia, amnesia, mood disorders, somatoform disorders, sleep disorders. So we have a whole host of disorders and categories of disorders that your symptoms may be able to be may fall into. So we see here some further examples of the category of diagnosis on the five axes. So this just want to give you an idea that this DSM is out there and it's employed quite regularly to help treat mental issues. Now there are some problems with diagnosing. We have critiques of diagnosing with the DSM. The DSM calls too many people disordered, some would say. Too many people have some sort of disorder. The border between diagnoses or between disorder and normal seem to be arbitrary. You're on this line, you're normal. You're on the other side of that line, you are non-normal or disordered. Number 3, decisions about what is a disorder seem to include value judgment. Is depression necessarily deviant? Number 4, diagnostic labels direct how we view and interpret the world, telling us which behavior and mental states to see as disordered. And obviously, when you are diagnosed with a mental disorder, there is a stigma, sort of an embarrassment sometimes. It's not so much as it used to be in the past generations, but there is sort of like a stigma to going to see somebody to seek some sort of help. It's much, much less than it was, but in previous generations, it was a big deal. So the stigma and stereotypes. Many people think a diagnostic label means being seen as tainted, weak, or weird. So you have been labeled as something, and now you have this stigma and the stereotype associated with that individual. However, these negative views or stigma come from popular cultural views of mental illness and not from the DSM. You can see this, for example, about how people who have mental illness or mental disorders are portrayed in television and movies. The DSM may contain the information to correct inaccurate perceptions of mental illness. So if you read it, you'll understand exactly what the belief or perception you have may be off or inaccurate, and so on. So the obvious issues, there are many. So some of the stigmas and labels is not the DSM's fault, but just society and society's fault when it comes to how it is that people with mental illness may be portrayed. So we see a lot of incorrect information out there as well, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Now, Another issue that pops up is going to be insanity and responsibility. Because oftentimes when we hear psychological disorders, they may be associated with some sort of criminal activity or something. And so usually we hear things, for example, somebody was not in their right mind when they committed a certain act or crime. Jared Loughner shot many people, including a U.S. representative in 2011. Loughner had schizophrenia and substance abuse problems, a combination associated with increased violence. To what degree, if any, should he be held responsible for his actions? That's always the thing that we talk about when things happen, when people who do have mental illness, documented mental illness specifically, do commit some sort of crime. What do we expect to do with them by way of punishment for the crime they committed? And what is, again, the appropriate consequence? So schizophrenia alone is not associated with an increased risk for violence. It's not. However, schizophrenia plus substance abuse increases the risk for violent behavior. Both people who see him as not responsible for his actions and those who see his mental illness as part of who he is and thus making him responsible might agree that the appropriate consequence might be confinement with mandatory treatment rather than simply imprisonment. So let's go ahead and look at some of these disorders. Let's at least start the idea of looking at anxiety disorders. I want to introduce this topic, then we'll stop there and pick up on this a little bit later. So anxiety disorders, our self-protective risk reduction instincts in overdrive. Our self-protective risk reduction instincts in overdrive. So what we have is generalized anxiety disorder, painful worrying, panic disorder, fear of the next attack. We have phobias. Don't even show me a picture of whatever it is that you have a phobia of. You get all upset about it. OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. I know it doesn't make sense, but I can't help it. You keep doing something over and over. You're obsessed about it. You think about it, and you're compelled to do something about it. And then we have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Stuck, re-experiencing a particular traumatic event. We now can also examine some of the causes of anxiety disorders, fear conditioning. You can learn it through observational learning. Some of it could be sort of a genetic evolutionary predisposition, and also we can have brain involvement as well. So we'll pick up on this a little bit later.